All right, welcome. This is a class that I promised to record for the congregation here at Edgewood, but I will put it out to anyone that wants to um, follow along. This is a class that we just started last week called How We Got the Bible. And we're looking at different steps to get the Bible from the mouth of God to us, to our written Bibles or our electronic Bibles. And I said in that class that there's going to be too much information that we won't be able to get into in all of the semester, this quarter. So to kind of fill in the parts that we won't be able to get to, I'm going to make some videos like this. And so we're going to be talking about lesson 2. We're going to talk a little bit about authorship. So let's just kind of get into it. And so just a little review here. Lesson number 1, we talked about the first step in how we got the Bible is that God decided to reveal himself to us. And Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1, we looked at that and it told us that God revealed himself in many ways and at different times. And so we went through and looked at several different ways that God revealed himself throughout the history of mankind. Direct revelation through angels, through the angel of the Lord, by visions and dreams, the Urim and the Thummim, the casting of lots, creation, um, and then also as well prophets. And then we talked about miracles, lots of different ways that God revealed his message, revealed his will, revealed himself to the world through the law, the written law, and what we'd say the unwritten law, the law written in our hearts, through Jesus Christ, through written revelations. And maybe you could think of a few others. But it's amazing all the different ways that God has revealed himself and the different styles, just in the written word, all the different genres. The Bible is truly a unique book because of several factors. Obviously, because it is the revelation of God, but the way that and the different ways that God chose to reveal himself are really, really unique. So, we're going to talk about in the next few lessons authorship. Sunday morning, we're going to talk about inspiration. And then eventually, we're going to get to what's called canonicity. But in this lesson, we're going to just talk about authorship. And so, what I want you to understand is that as you look at the ancient times, obviously, God is revealing himself first orally, right? He's choosing certain people in which to give a revelation, and at various times they are then to be like prophets. They are to speak the message to other people, not just to themselves. But eventually, God chooses someone to write down his message, write down his revelation. And so throughout the Old Testament times, and then in between what we call the Old Testament, New Testament, books are being written, biblical books. But what I wanted to understand is that these biblical books were not the only books written in ancient times. And what I mean by that, they are not the only religious writings throughout the history of the Bible. Obviously, there were other authors writing religious material, letters, epistles. Um, and what is interesting is the Bible actually makes reference to many of these. For example, in Joshua chapter 10 and verse 13, the story of where the sun stood still. It is recorded by Joshua, but Joshua then gives us kind of, if you will, a little footnote. And he says, there is also this written and maybe even more information in the book of Yashir. And so that is not a biblical book, but is a book that was known by the author of Joshua, and he makes reference to it, and perhaps maybe even had used that as a reference for his own storytelling. In Numbers 21, verse 14, there is make mention of a book called the Book of the Wars. Again, not a biblical book, but one that was known and then cited by Moses in Numbers 21. In First Chronicles 9, verse 1, and in several other places, you have a reference to, if you want to know more about a particular king, go look in the book of Kings. Now you'll see that this is referenced in Chronicles. And we might think, well, that's the biblical book of Kings, but it is not. This is a non-biblical book with almost the same name, the Book of Kings. And you say, well, how do you know that? Well, there are several references in Chronicles to a king or a story that supposedly is in the Book of Kings, but it is not in the biblical Book of Kings. And so that is a hint that this is a non-canonical, non-biblical book known as the Book of Kings. And in reverse order, in the Book of Kings, there is this reference to the Book of Chronicles. And again, the hints are that this is not the biblical Book of Chronicles, but it was, again, an extra biblical book with that same title, Chronicles. And so there's these other books that are cited. And then in addition to that, there is what is known as the Apocryphal books. Now, these are not in our Bible. They're not in the canon of our Bibles, but they are in certain canons. For example, the Catholics and the Orthodox Bibles contain these books, and those books are intertwined, and they are read as if they are part of the canon of the Bible in their worship services. And so there's these other religious books that some are referenced by the Bible, mentioned, some are not, but they're not part of the books of the Bible. And so that leads to this question, and sometimes this is actually an attack on the Bible, and that is, why are these books not in the Bible? Why are they left out? If they're written around the same time, they're religious, why are these books not in the Bible? And that's a good question. And that is a question we're going to dive into more in depth when we get to this section called canonicity. Okay. But in this regard, I want to kind of talk about this question, especially in regard to authorship. Okay. So along with that, we might ask this question: how did the Jews know they were not inspired, right? God's people obviously were trying to recognize, okay, this writing is the revelation of God. It is from inspiration. This writer was inspired by the Holy Spirit. This one was not. So how did they recognize, how did they figure out that this book should be in the Bible and this should not? In other words, this book was inspired and therefore the revelation of God, and this one was not. And again, we're going to talk about that more in depth when we get to these next sections of inspiration and especially canonicity. But what I want you to know, and this is a main point, is that God's people had a process, that God expected them to be able to recognize true revelation, truth from a lie, true revelation from a false prophet. God expected that. And there are several passages, Old Testament, New Testament that show that God expected them. There was a testing process. And so one of those things, not the only factor, but one of those factors was who's the author. And so who the author carried a lot of weight. Was it a known prophet of God like Moses or Paul or Peter? Was it a known person associated with the apostles, like Mark with Peter or Luke with Paul? Um, so though that was a very big criteria, and that often had a lot of weight in determining or recognizing that this book was inspired, this author was not. So I want you to know that that was a process. And so when there was questions about who the author was, we might not know who the author is, then those other criteria became very, very important. Criteria we'll talk about in another lesson. And so just because you didn't know who the author was did not mean that a book was not recognized as inspiration, was not put in the canon, but oftentimes it would raise questions. And so God's people would raise questions of, should this be in the Bible or should it not be in the Bible? And this questioning, because of authorship or even other criteria, what was not a kind of what we might say a skeptic or liberal charge where they're trying to keep books out of the Bible that should be in the Bible. It's the opposite. It is God's people making these questions so that they can make sure that what goes in the Bible truly is the revelation of God, and what is not, right? So I want you to know there's a process, and the part of that process that we're looking at in this lesson is authorship. All right, some questions. So who is the traditional author of these first 5 books of the Bible, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. I think we pretty much know that one, right? It's Moses. And there is a well-established outside the Bible tradition of this and evidence of this, but there is also a very big internal, inside the Bible evidence of Moses writing the law. And so here's several passages, even in Joshua, talking about Moses writing. There's actually a song of Moses that is in, I believe, the book of Exodus, and then in the book of Songs, or the book of Psalms. And so this gives us a good example that the fact that Moses is seen and is evidence of being the author of these first 5 books, those books were not challenged. They weren't questioned. It kind of had universal acceptance by God's people. Even the Samaritans held to these first 5, or the Pentateuch of the Old Testament. And so authorship played a vital role in recognizing, okay, these books should be in the Bible. They are inspired because they are written by Moses. But what about the next book, the book of Joshua? Okay. Well, here's what I call a bonus question. There were questions that came up about Joshua, if it was inspired, if it should be in the canon of the Old Testament. So some did question that Joshua wrote the book because he does something before the end of the book. Do you know what he does? Or maybe we should put it this way: what happens to Joshua before the end of the book? Well, I want you to think about that as we talk about the traditional view. The traditional view is that Joshua is the author of the book bearing his name. And there is some internal evidence of that. Joshua 24, verse 26, has a reference to Joshua writing or being told to write. The Jewish Talmud also claims that Joshua is the author. And so there is a Jewish tradition, and that's usually where this traditional view of Old Testament authorship comes about. And so that's the evidence, not all, but that is some of the evidence that points to Joshua. But some of the questioning, maybe we could call it opposition, but some of the questioning about, well, was Joshua really the author, comes about because, well, here's the answer to the question. Joshua dies before the book is over. And so towards the end of the book, it records the death of Joshua, and then the story continues. Well, how can he write the rest of the story if he's dead? And that's a good question. And because of that fact, many kind of question whether we should see Joshua as the author of this book. In addition, the book is written as if the author is an eyewitness, but not Joshua. So, in other words, Joshua doesn't talk about himself, if he's the author, in the first person. He doesn't say, I did this. He talks about it in the third. Joshua did this. Joshua told the people. Joshua spoke to the people. Well, that is not a big factor because you'll see Moses does the same thing. Moses does not write in the first person, but is well established that Moses wrote those first 5 books, including the sections that he is involved in the story. So the second one is not as big a factor when you consider those, and that's what happens. These questions come about, and God's people discuss, and they make these points. Well, Moses did the same thing. And so what happens is there's kind of this effort to, all right, well, if Joshua is the author, then what do we do about after he dies? Well, to kind of answer that, the Jewish tradition had this answer, that the high priest Eleazar recorded Joshua's death. And then after Joshua dies, the book records Eleazar's death. And so then they would say, well, his brother Phinehas, or the next high priest, Phinehas, recorded Eleazar's death. And so, that does fix that question. Is there evidence of that? That's the question. Apparently, there was enough evidence to at least answer this question. Now, another answer to this, a secondary view of this, is that Samuel wrote the book of Joshua. Now, he was not around in the days of Joshua. He comes about in the early part, or in the part of Judges, right? But there's interesting phrase. 4 times in the book of Joshua, and you see the passages there, 4 times in the book of Joshua, the author says there's something that happened, or something that existed, or something that was created, and it is like that until this day. In other words, as the author is writing, he seems to be writing after these events, telling them what happened in the Joshua, it's still like that, even as I write this. And so that gives credence that this seems to be an author that is writing post the time of Joshua. And so some believe Samuel is the author, and he would kind of fit that time period well. And then there is kind of more of a generic that Joshua wrote most of the book, but the last part about his death, Eleazar's death, the end of the book was written by another author. We don't know who that author is. That's kind of why it's more generic. But apparently, these questions came to be answered well enough to where, even though we're not exactly sure about the author, Joshua comes to be accepted into the canon of the Bible. And so it gives you kind of a flair of, you know, authorship. And when that authorship came to be questioned, kind of how these books eventually came to be accepted. It also gives us an idea of that criteria that we've been talking about. All right, let's talk about the next book, Judges. Okay. The traditional view of Judges is Samuel, that Samuel wrote the book of Judges. Again, the Jewish Talmud attributes the book to Samuel. Evidence of that is that there are references in the book of Joshua that shows us certain things were a certain way, certain things existed in the time of the judges that did not exist in a later period of time. For example, it seems very clear that the book of Judges had to be completely written before the time of Isaiah. For Isaiah actually mentions the book of Judges, makes a reference to it. Well, obviously, it had to be written if Isaiah is referencing the Judges or the book of Judges. Okay. There's also a reference that this might have been before the time of Solomon, for the Canaanites were living in the city of Gezer. But in Joshua 129, they are not. It's different than it was in the time of Solomon. And so it appears, since it's not that way in the time of Solomon, something had to change. And so it was before the time of Solomon. And we keep moving forward like this. And we also have a reference in Jerusalem that in the days of the judges, that the Jebusites were occupying Jerusalem. Now, in the days of David, at least 7.5 years after the time of king, or after he became king, David conquers Jerusalem, and the Israelites are living in Jerusalem. So, in the days of David, something that is mentioned in Judges is not the same. And so it appears that this is written before even the time of David. Well, when you get before the time of David, what are you talking about? You're talking about the time of Saul. And then before the time of Saul, you have Judges. And Samuel is in existence, right? He's alive all through that time up to a certain period in Saul's reign. So that is good evidence for possibly this being Samuel. Okay. But you also have a reference, kind of like we mentioned in Joshua, that twice it talks about in those days there was no king. Well, we know that after the period of Judges, in fact, in the period of Judges, they ask for a king, and God gives them Saul. And again, Samuel is alive during the days of King Saul. So that would lend credence that there's a king at this period of time, but it appears it's before the time of David. And again, that would lead credence to the time period of Samuel. Samuel was alive while there was a king. And so if he's writing the book of Judges, it would make sense that he's like, this was before there was a king. There was no king at that time. And so that's some of the evidence for Samuel. And again, because there is no author stated, there came to be some questions, but that evidence and others came to lead them to understand, okay, this is a book that needs to be in the Bible. Okay. Again, authorship is not the only criteria, but it is part of that criteria. All right, let's also reference the book of Kings, right? In our Bible, it's First and Second Kings, but in the ancient Hebrew Bible, it was one book. simply called kings. Okay. So here's the question. Are we told who is the author of Kings? And are we told who is the author of Chronicles? And the answer to that, of course, is no. We're not told. It's not like the New Testament epistles where the author is stated at the very beginning. Okay. So, what is the traditional view? The traditional view is Jeremiah. Say Jeremiah. Why Jeremiah? Well, let's give some of the evidence for that. Okay. Now, you might want to try this if you have you and someone else, and you have two Bibles of the same translation. So if you had one person, let's say we both had the New American Standard, and I had you go to 2 Kings 24:18, and I'm going to have you read verse 18 all the way to chapter 25, verse 30 of 2 Kings. And then I have another person, same translation, let's say New American Standard, and I'm going to have them turn to Jeremiah 52, and I'm going to have them start reading verse 1 all the way down to verse 34. And then I'm like, okay, are you ready? Start reading. And you're going to see they are going to be reading the same words, word for word, through that whole section. Jeremiah 52 is a word for word exact wording of 2 Kings 24:18 to chapter 25, verse 30. Might want to try it sometime, right? But that's amazing. Why would you have an exact worded section in Jeremiah that's in Kings? Well, that lends evidence that Jeremiah is using this material in both of his writings. The book of Second Kings, book of Kings, ends with the destruction of Jerusalem, but Babylon, the captivity, right? They were taken into captivity, is never described. Well, remember what happened? Jeremiah was there to witness the destruction of Jerusalem, but he was not taken into Babylonian captivity. Instead, he told the people, don't go to Egypt, live in the land. And they said, again, we're not going to listen to you. In fact, there is views that they maybe even forcefully took Jeremiah with them to Egypt. So there is some evidence within Kings that Jeremiah would fit as the author. And along with that, and this is big with some of these books, the prophetic books, is that prophets in the Bible are pictured as not just spokesmen for God, but writers or recorders of Israelite history. Now, I want to just go through a couple of these just to give you evidence. I find this amazing. Let's start in 1 Kings chapter 11. 1 Kings chapter 11. I'll go through this as quick as I can. And look at verse 41. And if you want to turn with me, and you can pause it for a second. Verse 41. 1 Kings. I'm in 2 Kings. Sorry about that. Not being very fast here. All right. 1 Kings 11:41. This is the author is talking about Solomon. And he says, now the rest of the acts of Solomon and whatever he did and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? So you have a reference that there's this other book. It's called the Acts of Solomon. Okay. So if you want to know more than what's written here, you can go and find that book and you can read it. Now let's go over to 2 Chronicles 9. 2 Chronicles 9, where we look at the parallel as it's talking about Solomon. And we want 2 Chronicles 9 and in verse 29. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon from first to last, are they not written in the records of Nathan the prophet, and in the prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite, and in the visions of Iddo the seer concerning Jeroboam the son of Nebat? Now, Chronicles seems to indicate possibly that this writing called the Acts of Solomon, who wrote that? Well, the prophets. You've got Nathan, Ahijah, and Iddo, all referred to as, you could go look at their writings and you'll see more written about Solomon. And so you have them as what? Recorders of history, not just spokesmen for God. Let's look at one more. 1 Kings 14:29, as we talk about Solomon's son Rehoboam, King Rehoboam. And in 1 Kings 14, verse 29, here the author says, now the rest of the acts of Rehoboam and all that he did, are they not written in the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? Okay. Again, you can go to this other book, the book of Chronicles, not the biblical book, but another book, an extra biblical book. Well, let's go over to 2 Chronicles 12, verse 15, where the author of Chronicles possibly is talking about that. He says, now the acts of Rehoboam from first to last, are they not written in the records of Shemaiah the prophet and Iddo the seer, according to the genealogical enrollment? And there were wars between Rehoboam and Jeroboam continually. Again, so in the king's list here, you'll have a book mentioned. You can go find this extra information in a book. And here on the right side, you will have the actual prophets, perhaps the actual authors of that writing, and they are the prophets. And I find that fascinating. And so that would lend credence that maybe Jeremiah is the author of Kings. Maybe there's a few other prophets that added to that. Maybe Chronicles was written by several prophets, or maybe one prophet. And so, again, you may not know the exact author, but evidence like this then went a long way in leading to the acceptance of these books. All right. We're going to talk, I think, about one more, and that is Jonah. Now, you talk about a book that even in our day, skeptics love. They love it because they're like, there's no way this should be in the Bible. The traditional view is Jonah, but there's a lot of questions about that. Again, Jonah, is he actually writing this truthful story about himself? He writes not in the first person, right? It seems to be written by someone else, but who else? Right? Well, we do know that he's a prophet. He's a minor prophet, as we say. So that there were questions about the authorship of Jonah, and not only that, but the content. The book makes no claim of authorship, and some of the questioning that came about because you've got this story of this big fish, this great fish that swallows Jonah, and Jonah survives 3 days in the belly of this fish and then spits him out, right? Well, that's a story that I mean, even we would have to admit, that sounds kind of mythical, right? It sounds kind of mythical. Does it mean that it's not true? No. Does it mean that it can't happen? No. But Jonah is a book that raises a lot of questions, but eventually those questions came to be answered, and it was accepted into the canon of the Old Testament, even though there were questions about the author, right? Well, was that Was that a good decision? Was that the right decision? Well, God's people did not have this evidence that I'm going to look at, but we do. And it kind of confirms, not only the right decision, that maybe God had something to do with this. That evidence is Jesus. Jesus makes reference to Jonah twice, two different occasions. Matthew 12, Luke 11, you can look at those. And he doesn't seem to indicate that this is just a mythical story, that it's not to be taken truthfully or seriously. No, it is a true story to Jesus. In fact, Jesus uses it to say, the same thing is going to happen to me. This is going to be the sign of my death, burial, and resurrection. And so Jesus is one of the best evidences that their process, along with, I believe, God's providence, led to the correct acceptance of the Old Testament canon, the Old Testament books. Jesus never, ever, says, hey, there's some books in there that shouldn't be in there. He never says there's some books that should be in there that are not. In fact, he quotes from so many of these books. And in fact, the apostles actually quote not only from these Old Testament passages, but quote from the Greek translation of them, quote from the Septuagint of them. And so Jonah is evidenced so well by Jesus, who evidences the validity, the trustworthiness of the Old Testament canon. And, in the New Testament, we had some books that were questioned, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those. But Hebrews, we have a book we don't even know who the author is, but meets all the other criteria. So it is well established as being an inspired revelation, inspired book from God. And that just gives you some insight. And so as we conclude this lesson, I hope you found this information fascinating. I do. We see that God used 24 plus men to write the Old Testament. We don't know for certain how many, because various authors, like various authors in Psalms, some of those authors are not named. Some books, the authorship is completely unknown. The book of Job, the book of Jonah, and yet they come to be accepted. Some books, the authorship was questioned, not in a, let's try to keep this book out, but in a way that we want to make sure we're recognizing true inspiration and that we have the right books in the canon of the Bible. And so most of these books come to be accepted, and therefore they are in our canon today, our Bible, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. All right, if you have any questions, let me know. We will talk about lesson 3 Sunday morning, a lesson about inspiration. Thank you so much.